Rain lashes a broken Heinkel on a forgotten Scottish island.
The rain came down in sheets, cold enough to burn, and every drop that hit the windscreen felt like a small fist pounding on Karl Heinrich's chest. He couldn't feel his feet anymore. The cockpit was freezing, the heater long dead, and the starboard Jumo engine was making a sound no pilot ever wants to hear a wet. Choking rattle that said the oil was gone and the bearings were chewing themselves to pieces. He kept the nose down anyway because lifting it would only make the good engine work harder, and they were already asking too much of everything. 23 years old, 3 months married, a photograph of Elise tucked inside his flight jacket right against the heart. He could still smell her perfume on it if he concentrated, even through the stink of glycol and burnt oil. He didn't dare look at the picture now. Not while he was trying to keep 5 men alive for a few more minutes. Behind him, Fritz Weber was praying. Not out loud. Just lips moving, eyes squeezed shut, the way boys do when they think no one is watching. Fritz had turned 20 last week. They'd shared a bottle of schnapps in the dispersal hut and pretended the war was somewhere else. Now Fritz's chart table was useless map-soaked, pencil broken, and the G-box had gone silent an hour ago. No fixes. No beacon. Just the North Sea rolling black below them and the compass swinging like it was drunk. Otto Braun, up in the dorsal turret, hadn't spoken in 40 minutes. He kept the MG-15 trained on nothing, swinging it left and right in slow mechanical arcs. Otto was the oldest at 29, married with 2 girls. He used to show photographs of them during briefings, proud and embarrassed at the same time. Tonight he hadn't said their names once. Hans Keller, the radio operator, sat hunched over his set, headphones still on, fingers moving across dials even though there was only static and the occasional garbled syllable of English that might have been a coastal command sighting report. Hans was the quiet one, never complained, never boasted, just did his job and went back to reading poetry in the bunkroom. Karl had caught him once crying over a letter from his mother. He'd pretended not to see, and Sepp Lang, the bombardier, was curled in the nose, knees drawn up, staring at the perspex like it might open and let him step out into the night. Sepp had the blackest humor in the staffel. Tonight he was silent. They had taken off from Sola at 3:17. 4 Heinkel 111 seconds. Only 2 had made it across the North Sea. The other pair turned back with engine trouble. Karl's formation pressed on because orders were orders, and the convoy was supposed to be their fat merchantman wallowing under a thin screen of destroyers. They never found it. Cloud base dropped, visibility went to nothing, and the flak ships stayed quiet. Somewhere over the Moray Firth they lost contact with the leader. Karl had taken over lead without being asked. No one argued. Then the starboard engine began to die. Now they were somewhere north of the Scottish mainland. Maybe the wind had pushed them west. The compass lied. The radio compass was blind. Fuel was down to fumes. Altitude 1,200 feet and falling. Karl could feel the controls growing heavy, the ailerons stiff with ice. He cleared his throat. The sound was startling in the cockpit. "We're not making Norway." No one answered at first. Then Fritz, voice thin, "How far to land?" "Too far." Karl didn't soften it. Lies wouldn't help now. "We did, sure we crash. I'm looking for anything flat. Beach, field, bog, anything." Sepp left once, short and ugly. Bog, perfect. "We'll sink like gentlemen." Karl ignored him. He banked gently left, trying to keep the good engine from overheating. The horizon was gone. There was only rain and black. Then, for maybe 3 seconds, a gap in the cloud, a darker shape against the sea. Land, small, jagged, too small to be the mainland, an island, unmarked on the chart. No lights, no harbor. It would have to do. "Brace," he said. "I'm putting her down there." He dropped the flaps, reduced power on the port engine, fought the yaw as the starboard prop windmilled. The airspeed bled away. 110, 95, 80. The island grew larger. A low hump of rock and wet grass, a sloping shoulder on the eastern side looked almost gentle. Almost. Carl lined up. No runway, no lights, just instinct and the faint grey line where grass met stone. He pulled the mixture back. The port engine coughed, then steadied. He felt the wheels come up useless anyway. The belly hit first. The jolt was enormous. Metal tore. Perspex cracked. The nose dug in, slewed left. Carl's head snapped forward, stars burst behind his eyes. Something heavy Fritz's chart board struck his shoulder. The aircraft cartwheeled once, slow and terrible, then slammed down again. The starboard wing folded like paper. Fuel poured out in a black rush, but miracle of miracles did not ignite. Then silence, real silence. No engines, no wind in the wires. Just the patter of rain on aluminum and 5 men breathing hard. Carl tasted blood. His lip was split. He fumbled with the harness, got it loose, turned. Bound off. Fritz groaned here, arms broken. Sepp coughed. Alive. Otto didn't answer. Carl crawled back. The dorsal gunner was still strapped in, head lolling, neck broken. Carl reached anyway, fingers searching for a pulse he already knew wasn't there. Nothing. Hans. No answer. Hans was slumped forward, a long splinter of canopy glass buried in his chest. Blood had soaked the front of his Mae West. Carl touched 2 fingers to the side of Hans's neck. Cool, still. He sat back on his heels, rain dripped through the roof. 3 alive. 3 out of 5. In less than 90 seconds. He looked at Fritz and Sepp. Fritz was cradling his wrist, teeth clenched. Sepp stared at the dead men like he didn't quite believe it yet. Carl swallowed. His voice came out hoarse. We get out, now. Before the fuel lights, they moved slowly, stunned. Sepp kicked the escape hatch open. Cold air rushed in, smelling of peat and salt. They dragged Otto and Hans out first, not leaving them inside a wreck that might burn later. Then they stumbled into the heather, slipping on wet rock, rain stinging their faces. The Heinkel lay on its side like a beached whale. One wing pointed at the sky, the other was crumpled beneath the fuselage. Smoke drifted from the dead engine, thin and grey. Carl looked at the sky. No stars, just cloud and rain. He looked at his men. We're alive, he said. It didn't feel like victory, but it was all they had left. They stumbled away from the wreck in the dark, boots sinking into wet peat that sucked at their legs like cold hands. Carl led, one arm around Fritz, who hissed with every step. Sepp brought up the rear, dragging the emergency pack, and the 2 bodies. They'd pulled out Otto and Hans wrapped loosely in a torn parachute silk. They didn't speak of leaving them behind. Not yet, not while the rain still fell like punishment. They found a shallow dip, maybe 50 yards from the aircraft, a natural hollow, where the heather grew thicker and the wind couldn't reach quite so viciously. Carl dropped to his knees first, tearing at the pack with numb fingers. Inside, 2 chocolate bars, a tin of emergency biscuits, 3 packets of powdered milk, a flare, pistol with 4 rounds, a small first aid kit, and 1 thin wool blanket meant for 1 man. Nothing else. No tent. No stove. No hope of a fire in this downpour. He handed Fritz the blanket. Wrap it around you. Keep that arm still. Fritz took it without argument, teeth chattering. His wrist was already ballooning, purple-black under the skin. Carl opened the kit. Morphine syrettes, sulfur powder, bandages, iodine. He knew enough field medicine to be dangerous. He cleaned the break as best he could in the dark, biting his own lip when Fritz cried out, then bound it tight with strips of bandage and a piece of aluminum torn from the wreckage. Fritz went pale, sweat mixing with rain on his face, but he didn't pass out. That was something. Sepp sat a little apart, knees drawn up, staring at the black bulk of the Heinkel. We should have burned it, he muttered. Carl looked at him. Why? So they don't find it. So they don't find us. They'll find it anyway, Carl said. Reconnaissance flies every day. Coastal Command. They'll see the scar in the heather from 10 miles out. Better they find 3 live men than 3 more bodies. Sepp laughed, a short, bitter sound. Live for how long? We've got maybe 2 days' food if we ration like monks. No water except what we catch in our caps. No shelter. Winter's coming. You know what happens when you sit still in Scotland in April? Carl didn't answer. He knew he'd read the survival manuals, hypothermia, trench foot, gangrene, and that was assuming the British didn't arrive first with bayonets and handcuffs. He crawled back to the fuselage, found a corner of the bomb bay that was still dry-ish, and dragged out what he could, a canvas map case, a few loose rounds for the MG-15, a half-empty bottle of Kummel someone had smuggled aboard for luck. He brought it all back to the hollow. They sat in a tight triangle, shoulders touching, sharing body heat. The blanket went over all 3 of them like a tent. It smelled of oil and cordite. For a long time nobody spoke. Just breathing, rain drumming on the silk, wind moaning around the rocks. Then Fritz, voice small, my mother always said I'd catch my death flying in bad weather. She was right. Carl felt something twist inside his chest. She'll be proud of you. Fritz gave a shaky laugh. She'll kill me herself if I don't come home. They passed the Kummel bottle. 1 swallow each. The liquor burned all the way down. A brief fire in the cold. Sepp took 2 swallows, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. You think they'll shoot us? He asked suddenly. Carl considered it. Not right away. They'll want to know where we came from, what we saw. Then maybe. Sepp nodded like he'd expected the answer. I heard stories. Some crews got treated all right. Tea, cigarettes. Then the cage. Others, he trailed off. Carl thought of the men who'd gone down over England, the ones who parachuted into fields full of pitchfork-armed farmers, the ones who never made it to interrogation. He pushed the thought away. We'll be correct, polite. We're officers, they respect that. Even as he said it, he knew how thin it sounded. The night stretched on. Sleep came in fits. 10 minutes here, 20 there, jerked awake by cold or pain or the sudden certainty that the wreck was burning. It never did. The fuel just leaked and soaked into the ground, black and stinking. At some point, Carl realized he was holding the photograph of Elise. He didn't remember taking it out. Her face smiled up at him in the faint grey that passed for light before dawn. She'd written on the back, Kaboldy, my hurts. Come home soon, my heart. He pressed his thumb over the words until the ink blurred. He tucked it away again. Deep, where it couldn't be lost. Dawn arrived, slowly, grudgingly. The rain eased to a steady drizzle. The island looked smaller in daylight, maybe 2 miles long, half that wide. Rocky cliffs on the west side dropping straight into the Atlantic, a sloping plateau of grass and heather on the east. No trees, no houses, no smoke. Just seabirds wheeling overhead, screaming. Carl stood, legs shaking. He climbed the low ridge behind their hollow until he could see the sea on both sides. Empty, no ships. No aircraft, just grey water and grey sky. He came back down. Fritz was awake, eyes red-rimmed. Sepp had already scavenged a canteen's worth of rainwater from a hollow in the rock. We need to move, Carl said. Find better shelter, higher ground. Somewhere the patrol boats won't spot us straight away. Sepp looked at him. You still think we can hide? I think we can try. They ate half a chocolate bar each. It tasted like wax and sugar and desperation. Then they buried Otto and Hans, no time for graves. They piled stones over the parachute silk. Said nothing religious, just their names, quietly, so the wind wouldn't take them. Carl looked at the wreck one last time. The Heinkel lay canted over, tail high, nose deep in the peat. One propeller blade bent backward like a broken finger. He felt a strange pang. That machine had carried them through 3 years of war. Through flak and night fighters and ice. Now it was finished, and so were they, in a way. Come on, he said. They started walking inland. 3 shadows against the wet green, moving slow because of Fritz's arm and because every step hurt somewhere new. Behind them the Heinkel sat silent, waiting for whatever came next, rust, salvage, or simply forgetting. Carl didn't look back again. He didn't need to. The plane wasn't going anywhere, and neither were they. The wind never stopped. It came off the Atlantic in long, low howls that found every gap in their clothing, every crack in their resolve. By mid-morning the drizzle had thickened into something between mist and rain, the kind that soaks through wool and leather and skin, until you can't remember what dry feels like. Carl kept them moving uphill, away from the wreck, toward the low spine of the island where the ground rose just enough to break the worst of the wind. Fritz was slowing them down. Every few steps he stopped, breath coming in short gasps, cradling the bandaged arm against his chest like it was something fragile and separate from him. Carl didn't push. He couldn't. Instead, he walked beside him, shoulder to shoulder, matching the shorter strides. Sepp ranged ahead, scouting, then came back with reports that were half hope, half curse. "There's a cleft up there," Sepp said after the 3rd climb. "Rock overhang. Not much, but it'll keep the rain off our backs. Better than sitting in the open like ducks." Carl nodded. "Lead on." They reached it after another 40 minutes, more stumbling than walking. The overhang was a shallow scoop in the cliff face, maybe 10 feet deep, roofed by a slab of basalt that jutted out like a broken shelf. The floor was damp stone and sheep droppings, but it was dry compared to everywhere else. They crawled in, backs against the rock, knees drawn up. The blanket went over their legs again. For the first time since the crash, the wind couldn't reach their faces. Carl opened the emergency pack once more. 1 chocolate bar left. 3 biscuits each. He broke them carefully, handed them out. They ate in silence, chewing slowly, making each crumb last. The sugar hit like a small shock, waking nerves that had gone numb. Fritz spoke first, voice rough. "How long do you think before they come?" Carl looked out at the grey sea. "Today. Tomorrow. Depends how close the patrol routes run. If a fishing boat saw the smoke yesterday, maybe sooner." Sepp snorted. "Smoke? We didn't burn, just leaked. Still leaves a scar, black peat, bent metal. They'll spot it from the air." Fritz swallowed. "And then they come ashore, armed, cautious. We stand up. Hands high, we say the words. We surrender. Krieg gefallen." Sepp picked at a loose thread on his cuff. "You really believe they'll just take us quietly?" Carl met his eyes. "I believe we give them no reason not to." The words hung between them. None of them believed it completely. They'd all heard the stories passed from crew to crew: RAF gunners who shot at dangling parachutes, home guard units who beat men senseless before the police arrived, interrogators who didn't always wait for questions. But they'd also heard the other stories: tea in china cups, dry socks, a cigarette before the cage. War was never one thing. It was both at once. They spent the afternoon watching the sky. No planes, no ships, just gannets folding their wings and diving into the swell and the slow turn of the tide far below. Carl tried to keep Fritz talking, anything to keep the shock at bay. He asked about the girl in Munich. Her name was Liesel. She worked in a bakery. She smelled of yeast and vanilla even after a 12-hour shift. Fritz spoke of her in short sentences, like he was afraid saying too much would make her disappear. "She said she'd wait," he finished. "Even if I came back missing pieces." Carl thought of Elise again. Not the photograph this time, just the memory of her hand on his cheek the morning he left for the last time. She hadn't cried. She'd kissed him hard, then turned away to the stove like it was any other day. He wondered if she still did that now, cooked for one, listened for footsteps that never came. Sepp, who had been quiet for a long stretch, suddenly stood. "I'm going down to the wreck." Carl looked up. "Why?" "Water. There's condensation inside the fuselage. Fuel cans. Maybe something we missed. It's too exposed. I'll be quick." Before Carl could argue, Sepp was gone, moving low and fast down the slope. Carl watched him until he disappeared behind a rise. Minutes crawled, 20, 30. Fritz shifted uneasy. He shouldn't be alone. Carl stood. Stay here. Keep warm. He followed Sepp's path, heart thudding harder than it had during the crash. The wreck looked different in daylight, more pitiful, more permanent. The Heinkel skin was already dulling, streaked with oil and peat. Sepp was inside, rummaging through the shattered cockpit. Carl called softly, "Sepp." No answer. He climbed up onto the wing root, peered in. Sepp was sitting on the floor of the radio compartment, back against the bulkhead, holding something small in his hands. Carl dropped down beside him. It was Hans's poetry book. A thin volume, dog-eared, the cover half torn off. Sepp had it open to a marked page. His fingers were black with oil. He used to read this when the flak got bad, Sepp said, never loud, just to himself, like it was a secret. Carl took the book gently. The page was Rilke, something about angels and terror and beauty. He couldn't read it now. The words swam. He didn't scream. Sepp went on. When the glass went in, just looked surprised. Then he was gone. Carl closed the book. He was a good man. Sepp laughed, a cracked sound. We're all good men until we're not. They sat there a long time. Rain dripped through the roof, plinking on metal. Carl felt the weight of the island pressing down the silence, the cold, the knowledge that no one was coming for them today. Sepp finally stood, found 2 more canteens, half full, and this, he held up a small metal flask. Schnapps. Real stuff, not the rot gut. Carl almost smiled. We'll save it. For what? For when we need to remember we're still human. They collected what they could, more bandages, a flare, a soaked logbook, and climbed out. The climb back up was harder, legs heavier, hearts heavier. When they reached the overhang, Fritz was asleep, curled tight under the blanket. Carl covered him again, then sat beside Sepp. They passed the flask once, just a sip each. It tasted of anise and fire and memory. Night came early. The sky turned the color of wet slate. No stars, no moon, just the sound of the sea eating the rocks below and the wind trying to find them. Carl kept watch first. He sat at the lip of the overhang, knees up, arms wrapped around them. He thought about surrender, about living, about what came after. He thought about Elise waking up alone again tomorrow, about Fritz's girl waiting for a letter that might never arrive, about Sepp's silence, which was louder than any scream. He didn't pray. He hadn't prayed in months, but he made a promise instead. If they lived through this, he would write to Elise every day he could. He would tell her the truth, not the hero stories, but the small ones. The cold, the fear, the way 3 men sat under a rock and shared a blanket and tried not to break. He would tell her he loved her, and he would come home, even if he had to crawl the last mile. The wind answered with another long moan. Carl pulled his collar higher and kept watch. The island listened and waited. The 3rd day broke colder than the ones before. The wind had shifted during the night, hauling straight out of the northwest now, carrying the sharp, salt bite of open ocean and the faint, impossible smell of wood smoke that couldn't possibly be there. Carl woke with a start, neck stiff, mouth tasting of iron and yesterday's chocolate. Fritz was shivering violently beside him. Blanket pulled tight around his shoulders, the bad arm cradled like a wounded animal. Sepp was already awake, squatting at the edge of the overhang, staring down toward the sea. Carl crawled over. Anything? Sepp shook his head, nothing moving, but the tide's high, covers half the beach we could have used for a signal. They had talked about it the night before, in low voices, build a fire, lay out the parachute silk in the shape of a cross, fire a flare when they heard engines, simple, desperate. But the rain had soaked everything. The heather was too wet to burn, and any smoke they managed would be torn apart by the wind before it rose 20 feet. Carl looked at Fritz. The boy's lips were bluish. His eyes had the glassy look of someone who'd been cold too long. We need to get him warmer, Carl said. Sepp nodded. Body heat's all we've got. They moved closer together. sandwiching Fritz between them. Carl wrapped one arm around the boy's shoulders. Sepp did the same from the other side. They sat like that for a long time, 3 men breathing in rhythm, trying to share what little warmth remained. Fritz's teeth chattered against Carl's collarbone. "I keep seeing hands," Fritz whispered after a while, the way he just stopped, like someone turned off a light. Carl tightened his grip. "Don't think about it, I can't stop." "Then remember the good parts," Sepp said, surprising them both. His voice was rough, almost gentle. He used to hum Mozart when he thought no one could hear, badly, off-key, but he never stopped. Fritz gave a small, broken laugh. He said it kept the night fighters away. They stayed quiet after that. The island felt smaller now, the sea closer, the sky lower. Hunger had moved past gnawing into something dull and constant, like a bruise you stop noticing until you press it. They had 1 biscuit left each. They ate them slowly, crumbling them into their mouths, letting the dry grains melt on the tongue. Midday brought the first real break in the weather. The clouds tore open for perhaps 20 minutes, letting a thin, cold sunlight spill across the heather. Carl stood immediately. "We move," he said. "Higher. Find a place where we can see both sides of the island. If a boat comes, we'll spot it." Sepp looked doubtful. "Fritz can't climb much more. I'll carry him." They tried. Carl hoisted Fritz onto his back, piggyback style. The boy's good arm looped around his neck. Fritz was lighter than he should have been. War and fear had already burned the weight off him. Sepp carried the pack and the blanket. They moved slowly up the spine of the ridge, boots slipping on wet rock, breath fogging in sharp bursts. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the highest point, a flat shelf of stone maybe 300 feet above the sea. From there they could see the whole island, the wreck still lying crooked on the eastern slope, the black scar of disturbed peat around it, the cliffs dropping sheer on the west, and far below, a narrow shingle beach where the tide had left long ribbons of kelp. They sank down in the lee of a boulder. Carl eased Fritz off his back and propped him against the rock. The boy's face was grey. Sweat stood on his forehead despite the cold. Carl checked the arm. The bandages were filthy, soaked through. He unwound them carefully. The skin beneath was hot, swollen, streaked with angry red lines crawling up toward the elbow. Infection. Fast. Sepp saw it too. Neither of them spoke. Carl cleaned it again with the last of the iodine-sprinkled sulfur powder that was already clumping and rewrapped it. Fritz didn't cry out this time. He just stared at the sky, eyes unfocused. "I'm sorry," Carl said quietly. Fritz blinked. "Not your fault." "It is. I flew us into this. You flew us alive." Carl looked away. The words hurt more than he expected. They spent the afternoon there watching. The sun stayed long enough to dry their clothes a little, then vanished behind fresh cloud. No ships, no planes, just the endless grey Atlantic rolling in, breaking, retreating. Sepp broke the silence. "You ever think about what you'll do after?" Carl almost laughed. "If we get out of here, when?" Carl considered it. Really considered it. "I'll go home. Kiss my wife until she laughs. Hold my daughter until she forgets I was ever gone. Then maybe I'll find a quiet job. Teach children how to read maps instead of how to drop bombs on them." Sepp nodded slowly. "I want to fish again, like my father, out on the Baltic before dawn. Just the water and the gulls and the smell of diesel. No orders, no targets. Fritz, voice faint, I want to marry Liesel. In the little church near her bakery, with flowers in her hair, and then we'll have a house with a garden. And kids who never hear an air raid siren. They let the words hang. They sounded like fairy tales. Impossible. Beautiful. As the light began to fail, Carl stood again. He walked to the edge of the shelf, looked down at the wreck. From here it looked small, fragile, a child's toy dropped and forgotten. He felt something shift inside him, not hope exactly. Acceptance, maybe, or the beginning of it. He turned back to the others. We stay here tonight. Best view. Tomorrow, if no one comes, we go down to the beach. Make a signal they can't miss. Even if it means standing in the open. Sepp met his eyes. And if they shoot first? Carl didn't flinch. Then we die on our feet, not hiding like rats. Fritz reached out with his good hand. Carl took it. Sepp added his own. 3 hands clasped together against the rock, against the wind, against whatever came next. The sun bled out behind the horizon. The temperature dropped hard. They pulled the blanket over all 3 of them again, sat shoulder to shoulder, and waited for morning. Carl kept the photograph of Elise inside his jacket, pressed against his skin. He didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He could still see her face clearly enough to keep breathing. And for tonight, that was enough. The 4th morning came with a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. No wind for once, just a heavy, wet stillness that pressed down on everything. Carl woke to find frost riming the edges of the blanket, a thin white crust that cracked when he moved. Fritz was burning up. Sweat slicked his forehead despite the cold, and when Carl touched his cheek, the skin was furnace hot. The boy's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "Papa?" Fritz murmured. Carl's throat closed. He smoothed the damp hair back from Fritz's brow. "It's me, Carl. You're safe." Fritz blinked slowly. "It hurts, I know." Sepp was already up, crouched beside the small pile of stones they'd used as a windbreak. He looked at Carl over Fritz's head. His eyes said what neither of them wanted to voice. The infection was winning. The red lines had crept past the elbow now, angry and thick. Without penicillin, without a doctor, Fritz had days, maybe less. Carl swallowed. "We have to get him down to the beach. Today. If a boat comes, they'll have medicine. They have to." Sepp nodded once. "And if they don't, then we make sure they see us." They ate nothing. There was nothing left, just sips of rainwater collected in the canteen cap. Carl tore the last strip of clean bandage from the kit and rebound Fritz's arm as gently as he could. The boy whimpered once, then bit down on his own sleeve to stay quiet. When it was done, Carl helped him stand. Fritz swayed, legs unsteady, but he didn't fall. They started down the ridge in the pale grey light. Carl took Fritz's good arm over his shoulders. Sepp walked ahead, clearing the worst of the loose stones. The descent was slow, agonizing. Every step jarred Fritz's arm, drew a sharp hiss of breath through clenched teeth. Halfway down, Fritz stumbled and would have gone over if Carl hadn't caught him. They stood there locked together, breathing hard. "I can't," Fritz whispered. "You can," Carl said. "One more step, then another. That's all." Fritz nodded, eyes squeezed shut. They moved again. By the time they reached the shingle beach, the sun had burned through the overcast and lay low and weak across the water. The wreck was visible above them now, a dark shape against the green slope, almost innocent looking from this distance. Carl lowered Fritz to sit against a flat boulder, back supported, legs stretched out. The boy's breathing came in shallow pants. Sepp looked around. "We need a signal." "Something big." Carl followed his gaze. Driftwood lay scattered along the tide, line-long spars of timber, probably from some long-ago wreck, bleached silver by salt and sun, enough to build a fire if they could get it going. They gathered what they could. Sepp found a rusted tin can half buried in the shingle. Carl pried open the cap of their flare pistol and used the last of the gun oil to soak a rag torn from his own shirt. They built the pile, carefully small at first, then larger, stacking the wood like a funeral pyre. When it was ready, Carl struck the flare pistol striker. The cartridge popped, bright magnesium white, and the rag caught. Flame licked up, hesitant at first, then stronger as the oil fed it. Smoke rose thin at first, then thickening as the damp wood hissed and popped, black against the pale sky. Carl fed it carefully, adding larger pieces. The fire grew, crackling, throwing heat against their faces. For the first time in days they felt warmth that wasn't borrowed from each other's bodies. Fritz watched it with half-closed eyes. "Pretty," he said softly. Carl knelt beside him. They'll see it. Someone will. Fritz tried to smile. You always say that, because it's true. They waited hours. The fire burned down to coals. They fed it again. The sun climbed, crossed the meridian, began its slow fall toward the west. No planes, no boats. Just the slow crash of waves and the gulls crying overhead. Sepp stood suddenly. Listen, Carl strained. At first nothing. Then faint, far off the low throb of engines. Twin, not a fighter. Something heavier. He scanned the horizon. There, a dark shape moving west to east, low over the water. British Coastal Command, probably a Hudson or a Sunderland out on routine patrol. Carl grabbed the flare pistol. 1 round left. He aimed high, pulled the trigger. The flare arsed up. Brilliant red against the grey, hung for long seconds, then faded. The aircraft banked immediately. Hard left, wings dipped in acknowledgement. It circled once, twice, then turned away back toward the mainland, engines fading. They had been seen. Carl dropped to his knees beside Fritz. They saw us, they're coming. Fritz's head lolled against the boulder. Good. Sepp looked at Carl. How long? Hours, maybe by dark. They'll send a launch. Marines, not the home guard, proper soldiers. Sepp nodded. He walked to the water's edge, picked up a flat stone, skipped it across the waves once, twice, 3 times. Then he came back and sat down heavily. Whatever happens, he said, we did it right. We kept him alive this long. Carl looked at Fritz. The boy was asleep now or unconscious, hard to tell. His breathing was shallow, ragged. Carl leaned close. You hear me, Fritz? They're coming. You just hold on a little longer. Liesel's waiting. The bakery. The flowers. You go to see her again. No answer. Just the slow rise and fall of her chest, fighting to keep going. Carl sat back. He pulled the photograph of Elise from inside his jacket. For the first time since the crash, he let himself look at it fully. Her smile. The way her hair caught the light. The small crease between her brows when she was thinking. He pressed his lips to the paper, brief, fierce. I'm coming home, he whispered, even if it's in chains. The sun dropped lower. The fire burned low. Smoke still rose, thinner now, but steady. A marker. A plea. They waited. 3 men on a beach in the middle of nowhere. 1 burning. 2 watching, all of them hoping, in their different ways, that the next sound they heard would be boots on shingle instead of silence. The sea kept its rhythm. The gulls kept their watch. And somewhere far off, engines turned toward them again. This time, closer. The sound came first as a low vibration in the bone, then as a rumble that rolled across the water like distant thunder. Carl stood without realizing he'd moved. Eyes locked on the horizon where the sea met the sky in a thin silver line. A dark shape appeared low, grey, pushing a white bow wave. Not a fishing boat, not a trawler, a naval launch, sleek and purposeful, Royal Navy ensign snapping at the stern. 2 smaller boats flanked it, carrying men in khaki and steel helmets. Sepp rose slowly beside him. Here we go. Carl didn't answer. He knelt beside Fritz instead. The boy's breathing had grown shallow, uneven. His skin felt like paper stretched over fire. Carl lifted him gently, cradling the back of his head so it wouldn't loll. They're here, Carl whispered. Hold on now. Just a little longer. Fritz's eyelids fluttered. No words. Just a faint pressure of fingers against Carl's sleeve, weak, but there. The lead boat slowed, engines throttling back to a deep idle. A voice cracked over a megaphone, English clipped, careful. You on the beach. Stand up slowly, hands where we can see them, no sudden movements. Carl stood, lifting Fritz with him. He kept 1 arm under the boy's shoulders, the other raised, palm open. Sepp did the same, both of them outlined against the dying fire, smoke still curling lazily upward. We are unarmed, Carl called back. His English was accented but clear. We surrender. 1 man is badly wounded. A pause. The boats drifted closer. Carl could see the soldiers now, young faces under the rims of helmets, rifles leveled, but not yet aimed directly at them. A petty officer in a dark blue coat stood at the bow of the launch, binoculars raised. "Identify yourselves, Lieutenant Karl Heinrich, Luftwaffe. This is Unteroffizier Josef Lange and Gefreiter Friedrich Weber. We are the survivors of Heinkel, He 111, number 5J plus DL. We request medical assistance." Another pause. The petty officer lowered the glasses, spoke to someone behind him. Then the megaphone again. "Stay exactly where you are. We are coming ashore." The launch nosed in toward the shingle. 2 ratings jumped over the side into knee-deep water, rifles slung, hands free. They waded up the beach fast, eyes flicking between the 3 Germans and the smoking wreck on the slope above. Behind them, more men followed, 6, then 8, spreading out in a loose semicircle. No shouting, no panic. Just the quiet efficiency of men who had done this before. The first rating to reach them was barely older than Fritz. Freckles across his nose, hands steady as he approached Carl. "Easy now," he said softly. "We've got him." Carl let the soldier take Fritz's weight. The boy groaned once as they lifted him. 2 others moved in, supporting his legs, carrying him toward the boat like something fragile and precious. Sepp watched it happen without moving. His hands were still raised. A sergeant approached him, older, face lined, eyes tired. "You the pilot?" The sergeant asked Carl. Carl nodded, yes. The sergeant looked him over, then at Sepp, then up at the wreck. "Bloody long way from home." Carl didn't reply. There was nothing to say that wasn't obvious. They were searched quickly, professionally. No weapons found. The flare pistol was taken from Carl's belt. The small flask of schnapps was left untouched. Then they were walked down to the water hand, still raised, until the moment they stepped into the surf. The cold shocked Carl's legs awake. He almost stumbled. They helped him into the boat. Sepp followed. Fritz was already laid on a stretcher across the thwarts. A naval sick berth attendant kneeling beside him, cutting away the filthy bandage, swearing quietly under his breath as he saw the arm might lose it. The attendant muttered to no one in particular, "But we've got sulfur and morphine on board." More when we reached the mainland. Carl sat on the deck boards, back against the gunwale. Sepp beside him. Neither spoke. The engine started again. A low growl that vibrated through the hull. The launch reversed off the beach, turned in a tight arc and headed out toward open water. Behind them, the island shrank, first the beach, then the ridge, then the small dark shape of the Heinkel itself, still sitting where it had fallen, tail high, one wing pointing at the sky like a last salute. Carl watched it until it was too small to make out details. Until it was just a smudge against the green, until it was nothing at all. The sick berth attendant came over, crouched in front of Carl. "Your mate's in bad shape, but he's young. Strong heart. We'll get him to hospital. Stornoway, most likely. They've got proper surgeons there." Carl nodded. "Thank you." The man looked at him for a long moment. "You lot flew through hell to get here. We flew through hell to get anywhere." The attendant gave a small, humorless smile. Well, you're here now." They sailed for hours. The sea was kinder than it had been for days long, slow swells instead of sharp chop. Carl and Sepp sat in silence, shoulders touching, watching the horizon. No handcuffs. No blindfolds. Just 2 exhausted men in sodden Luftwaffe uniforms, surrounded by sailors who offered them tea in tin mugs and hard biscuits that tasted like heaven after days of nothing. Carl drank slowly. The tea was bitter, weak, but hot. It warmed him from the inside out. He looked at Fritz, still on the stretcher, now covered with a wool blanket and an oilskin. The boy's chest rose and fell. Steady. Not strong, but steady. Sepp leaned close. "He'll make it." Carl didn't answer. He just watched. Night fell. Stars appeared sharp, cold, more than he'd seen in weeks. The launch pushed on, navigation lights dimmed, wake glowing faintly behind them. Carl dozed in fits, head against Sepp's shoulder, waking every time the boat rolled or Fritz made a small sound. When the first lights of land appeared low, scattered, unmistakably Scotland, Carl felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, not yet, but the beginning of it. They docked just before dawn, a stone quay, waiting ambulances, men in white coats, stretchers, quiet orders. Fritz was taken first, carried up the gangway without a word. Carl stood to follow. A Marine put a gentle hand on his arm. "He's in good hands, sir. We'll take you to the same place later." Questions first. Carl nodded. He understood. They were marched off the boat, escorted, not dragged into a small stone building that smelled of carbolic and wet wool. A room with a table, 3 chairs, a single bulb overhead. An officer waited. RAF uniform. Cap on the table. No rank visible in the dim light. "Gentlemen," he said. "Sit." They sat. The questioning began quietly. Where from? When? What target? How many aircraft? Carl answered what he could truthfully, without flourish. Sepp did the same. No bravado, no lies, just facts delivered in flat voices. When it was over, the officer leaned back. "You'll be taken to a proper camp soon. Officer's compound. Red Cross parcels. You'll be treated correctly." Carl looked at him. "The boy, Fritz. Will he? He's in surgery now. They're fighting for the arm. No promises, but he's young and stubborn." Carl exhaled. "Thank you." The officer studied them both. "You kept him alive out there, that's not nothing." They were taken to separate cells, clean, dry, with a cot and a blanket each. Carl lay down without undressing. The mattress felt impossibly soft. He stared at the ceiling. He thought of Elise, of the letter he still hadn't answered, of the promise he'd made to himself on the ridge. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 5 days, he slept without dreaming of falling. Outside, the sea kept its rhythm. The island waited, silent now. Its only witness, a broken airplane and the slow turning of seasons. And somewhere in a hospital ward, a boy fought to keep breathing. One small victory in a war that had already taken so many. The cell door opened just after first light. A guard, Scottish, broad-shouldered, face like weathered granite, stood in the opening without entering. "Lieutenant Heinrich." "With me." Carl rose from the cot. His body ached in places he hadn't noticed before, bruises from the crash, stiffness from nights on stone and heather. He followed the guard down a short corridor that smelled of boiled cabbage, disinfectant. Sepp was already waiting in a small anteroom, still in the same sodden uniform, hair uncombed, eyes hollow but alert. They exchanged a single look, no words, just the small nod that had become their language over the last 5 days. The guard led them outside into a walled yard. A grey morning, sky the color of wet slate, air sharp with salt and coal smoke. 2 military policemen waited beside a Harkey truck, engines idling, no rifles visible, no handcuffs. Just quiet authority. "Get in," one of them said. They climbed into the back. Benches along the sides. A canvas flap closed behind them, shutting out the light. The truck lurched forward, tires crunching over gravel, then smoother tarmac. They rode in silence for perhaps 20 minutes. Carl counted the turns out of habit: left, right, straight. Left again until the motion stopped and the engine died. The flap opened. Out. They stepped down into the courtyard of a stone barracks. Union Jack limp on a short mast, sentries at the gate. A sign in English and Gaelic, nor 4 reception camp officers. The place looked more like a school than a prison. High walls, but no barbed wire on top. Yet, they were processed quickly. Names, ranks, numbers. Personal effects inventoried. Carl's watch stopped at 4:12 the morning of the crash. Elise's photograph handed back after a brief glance. A half-empty packet of cigarettes, neither of them smoked. Then showers, hot water, real soap, towels that didn't smell of oil. clean underwear. British battle dress trousers and shirts too large but dry. Their own uniforms taken away for delousing. Karl felt strangely naked without the familiar weight of the Luftwaffe tunic. After that, the medical officer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a soft Highland accent. He checked them over, bruises catalogued, cuts cleaned, lungs listened to. Karl's ribs were tender but not cracked. Sepp had a deep bruise across his shoulder blade from the impact. Nothing serious. And the boy? Karl asked. The doctor looked up from his notes. Weber? He came through surgery. They saved the arm barely. He's in the military hospital in town, sedated. Fever's down. He'll live. Might keep most of the hand if infection doesn't come back. Karl exhaled. The relief hit him like a wave he hadn't known was building. He sat down hard on the examination table. Sepp's voice was rough. Can we see him? Not yet. He's in isolation for now. Give it a day or two. When he's conscious, we'll arrange a visit under escort. They were taken to a small room with 2 bunks, a table, 2 chairs, a window with bars painted white, a Red Cross parcel already waiting, cigarettes, chocolate, sardines, powdered milk, a deck of cards. Someone had left a newspaper on the table. The front page showed a map of North Africa, arrows pointing forward, Rommel retreating. Karl looked away. They sat on opposite bunks. Neither spoke for a long time. Sepp finally broke the quiet. He'll write to Liesel. Karl nodded. He will, and you'll write to Elise. Every day I can. Sepp looked at the ceiling. I keep thinking about the island. How quiet it was after the engines stopped. Like the world forgot us. It didn't forget, Karl said. It just waited. They stayed like that until evening. Food came on trays, stew, potatoes, bread. They ate slowly, tasting everything. The stew was thin but warm. The bread was real, not sawdust. Karl saved half his chocolate for Fritz. When the lights dimmed for the night, Karl lay on his bunk, staring at the dark. He thought of the Heinkel still sitting on the slope, wings folded, waiting for rust and gales and the slow erasure of time. He thought of Otto and Hans under their cairn of stones. He thought of Fritz breathing in a hospital bed, one arm bandaged to the shoulder, the other reaching for a future that had almost slipped away. He thought of surrender not as defeat, but as a door, a way through. He closed his eyes. Sleep came easier than he expected. The next morning they were called to the commandant's office. A colonel, late 40s, mustache trimmed sharp, eyes that had seen too many interrogations. He spoke without ceremony. You'll be moved to a permanent camp tomorrow, Canada most likely, officers' compound. You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Red Cross visits, mail, parcels. Karl nodded. The colonel looked between them. You kept that boy alive out there. That matters. It won't be forgotten. He paused, then added, quietly, the wreck's been photographed. Coastal Command. They're calling it the last intact Heinkel on British soil. Remote, untouched. Some boffins already talking about leaving it as a monument, to remind people what war costs. Karl felt something shift inside him, not pride, not sadness, just recognition. Thank you for telling us, he said. The colonel stood. You're dismissed. Back in their room, Sepp looked at Karl. A monument. Karl gave a small, tired smile to 5 men who didn't want to die. Sepp laughed once, short, genuine. We didn't. They spent the afternoon writing letters. Karl on one side of the table, Sepp on the other. Pencil on thin paper. Karl wrote to Elise first. No heroics, just the truth. My dearest heart, I am alive. I am safe. I am coming home one day. There is a boy here who needs me to tell him the same. When I do, I'll be thinking of you. I love you more than I knew how to say before. Karl, he folded it carefully, addressed it, left it open for the censor. Sepp wrote to his father on the Baltic coast. Short sentences. Fishing boats. Dawn. A promise to come home and mend nets. When they finished, they sat in silence again. The light through the barred window turned gold, then red, then gone. Night came. Carl lay awake a little longer than Sepp. He thought of the island one last time. The wind, the rain, the fire on the beach. The moment the flare rose and the plane banked, he thought of Fritz waking tomorrow or the next day or the day after that and finding two men waiting in the corridor outside his ward. He thought of the Heinkel, alone now, under Scottish rain and Scottish sky, carrying the ghosts of two men and the memory of three who lived. He closed his eyes. For the first time since takeoff, he didn't dream of falling. He dreamed of coming home. The truck rattled north through rain-slicked roads that smelled of peat and diesel. Carl and Sepp sat opposite each other on the hard benches, knees almost touching, the canvas sides flapping like loose wings. No one spoke. The only sound was the engine's steady growl and the occasional drip of water finding its way through the roof seams. They had left the reception camp at first light. Destination, a permanent officers' camp somewhere in the borders. Canada was still a rumor, months away. For now, this was home, a barbed wire rectangle on Scottish soil, shared with other men who had fallen from the sky or walked out of burning cities. Carl watched the landscape slide past through a small tear in the canvas. Green hills, grey stone walls, sheep that didn't lift their heads as the truck passed. It felt strangely peaceful. No flak. No night fighters. Just quiet land doing what land does when men aren't trying to kill each other on it. They arrived in the early afternoon. The gates were iron, the wire double-stranded, the sentries polite but watchful. A sergeant with a clipboard checked their papers, then led them through the compound. Huts in neat rows. Football pitch. A small garden someone had started despite the season. Men in battle dress or greatcoats moved slowly between buildings, some reading, some walking in pairs, some simply sitting and staring at nothing. Their assigned room was in Hut 7. 4 bunks, 4 lockers, a stove that actually worked, a window that looked out on the hills instead of sea. 2 other Luftwaffe officers already there, both from KG-26, both shot down over England the year before. They stood when Carl and Sepp entered, offered hands, offered coffee from a battered pot. Real coffee, not ersatz. The gesture was small, but it landed like kindness. Carl took the lower bunk nearest the stove. Sepp took the one above. They unpacked the little they had: Red Cross chocolate, a few letters already written but not yet posted, the photograph of Elise that had survived salt water and blood. Carl placed it carefully on the shelf above his pillow, where he could see it when he woke. That evening they were allowed to visit the hospital. The ward smelled of carbolic and boiled milk. White screens, low voices. A nurse with a soft Glasgow accent led them to the end bed. Fritz lay there, propped on pillows, eyes open for the first time in days. His left arm was swathed in fresh bandages from shoulder to fingertips. Tubes ran from a bottle on a stand into the back of his good hand. His face was thinner, paler, but the fever had broken. When he saw them, something lit behind his eyes. Carl stopped at the foot of the bed. Sepp stayed a step behind. Fritz tried to sit up straighter. You came. Carl managed a smile. Told you we would. The nurse adjusted the drip, then stepped away. 10 minutes, gentlemen. He's still weak. They pulled chairs close. Sepp spoke first, voice rougher than usual. You look better than the last time I saw you. Less like a ghost. Fritz gave a small laugh that turned into a cough. Feel like one too, but they say the arm might stay. Fingers too, maybe. Can't move them yet. Carl reached out, rested a hand on the blanket over Fritz's knee. You kept breathing. That's what mattered. Fritz looked between them. The island, it feels like a dream now. Like it happened to someone else. It happened, Carl said quietly. And we got through it. Together, they sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Fritz told them about the morphine dreams, flying again, but without fear, the engine smooth, the sky clear. Carl told him about the tea on the launch, how it tasted like life itself. Sepp just listened, nodding now, and then when the nurse returned, Fritz looked at Carl. Will you write to Liesel for me, just until I can hold a pen? Carl nodded. I'll write her tonight. Tell her you're safe. Tell her you're fighting like hell. Fritz's eyes filled. Tell her Tell her I'm coming home. I will. They stood. Sepp leaned down, pressed his forehead briefly to Fritz's. Rest, kid. We'll be back tomorrow. Fritz closed his eyes. Tomorrow. Outside in the corridor, Karl leaned against the wall for a moment. Sepp waited beside him. He'll make it, Sepp said. I know. They walked back to the camp under a sky that had finally cleared, stars sharp enough to cut the hills' dark shapes against the night. Somewhere far off, a train whistled, civilian, ordinary, going somewhere people still went for reasons that weren't war. Months passed. Letters arrived, slow, censored, precious. Elise wrote every week. She was safe. Their daughter had started walking. She asked for Papa in her small voice. Karl wrote back the same way, truthful, careful, full of small details that said, I'm still here. Fritz improved. First he sat up without help. Then he walked the ward with a nurse on each side. Then he came back to the camp on crutches, arms still bandaged but no longer threatened by amputation. He learned to write left-handed. He wrote to Liesl every day. Sepp started a small woodworking group in the camp workshop. He carved bird skulls, mostly. One for each man who hadn't come back. One day he gave Karl a small wooden Heinkel, no bigger than a hand. Rough but accurate. Karl kept it on his shelf beside Elise's photograph. Years later, long after the war ended, long after the camps closed, long after, Karl stepped off a train in Hamburg and felt Elise's arms around him like they. Dee never let go long after Fritz married Liesl in that little church with flowers in her hair, long after Sepp went back to the Baltic and mended nets under the same dawn he'd dreamed of. Karl read a small article in a newspaper. A documentary team had visited the island. The Heinkel was still there. Weathered, rust-streaked, wings sagging, fuselage half buried in peat, Britain's last remaining German bomber wreck from the war. Untouched, protected by remoteness and time. They called it a silent memorial. Karl folded the paper. He walked to the window of his small house on the Elbe. His daughter, now taller than her mother, was playing in the garden. Fritz's son, visiting for the summer, ran beside her laughing. Karl looked out at the river. The water moved slow and steady the way it always had. He thought of 5 men in a broken airplane. 3 who walked away. 2 who didn't. He thought of a flare rising red against a grey sky. Of hands clasped on a rocky shelf. Of a boy who kept breathing because 3 men refused to let him stop. He thought of the Heinkel still sitting on that slope, carrying their story long after the men themselves had gone home. It wasn't glory. It wasn't victory. It was simply proof that something human had endured. Karl turned away from the window. He picked up a pen and began another letter to Fritz, to Sepp, to anyone who still remembered. He wrote, "We lived." And that was enough. If this story of quiet endurance, impossible choices, and the stubborn heartbeat of survival touched you, please subscribe to Red Map's World War II for more forgotten chapters from the Second World War.